Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit for the formal dissolution of the band's partnership at the High Court of Justice in London, England on December 31, 1970, against Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and John Lennon. Although McCartney's decision was at the time seen as the beginning of the Beatles' demise, it ultimately allowed the band to maintain control over their song collection, ownership of Apple Corps Limited, and other things up to this day. In 2020, McCartney stated, "I was thought to be the guy who broke up the Beatles and the bastard who sued his mates. And I did fall for that, I promise. It was so common that I nearly put the blame on myself for years." Not long after the band formed Apple Corps in 1968, issues started when they engaged New York City accountant Alan Klein as their manager. The other members of the band, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, wanted to collaborate with Klein, who had established ABKCO Music and Records Incorporated, managed Sam Cooke in the early 1960s, and had also worked with British musicians like as Donovan and Herman's Hermits. McCartney was on the other side, already wary of Klein from his shady past interactions with the Rolling Stones, and would have much rather had his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, handle his and the band's business. Klein was also managing the Rolling Stones at the time, and the band and manager were embroiled in legal disputes. The band was apparently cautioned by Mick Jagger not to deal with Klein. Jagger wrote McCartney a note that said, "Don't go near him." McCartney and Klein fell out almost immediately after he was recruited, following the departure of long-standing band producer George Martin, who was replaced by Phil Spector to complete the band's 12th and final album, Let It Be. McCartney objected to the new producer's modifications to his song, The Long and Winding Road, and wanted it taken out. The discord within the band was further intensified by Klein's arrival. On April 10, 1970, McCartney announced that he was no longer working with the Beatles after facing resistance from the band, and Klein when he attempted to release his self-titled solo debut ahead of Let It Be. McCartney sued Klein through the band because he was unable to suit the singer personally. McCartney stated, "There was no way I was going to work that hard for my entire life and see it all vanish in a puff of smoke. So there was no way I was going to save it for myself. I also knew that I would save it for them as well, should I be able to save it, because they were going to part with it. Klein was a guy they adored. I exclaimed, he's a fucking idiot." The Beatles' lawsuit was successfully fought by McCartney in 1971, but the band's assets were placed under receivership until the four members could agree on a mutually agreeable dissolution agreement. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr continued to work with Klein after the case, but when his management contract expired in March 1973, they declined to extend it. In response, Klein filed a $19 million lawsuit against Apple Corps and the Beatles. In a 1973 interview with Weekend World, Lennon stated, "I don't want to go into the details of it, but there are many reasons why we finally gave Klein the push. Perhaps Paul's misgivings were justified and the timing was ideal." A presumed jab at the band's previous management, Lennon later penned "Steel and Glass" from his 1974 album Walls and Bridges. "Well, your mouthpiece squawks as he spreads your lies, but you can't pull strings if your hands are tied. Well, your teeth are clean, but your mind is capped. You leave your smell like an alley cat." McCartney stated, "I had to sue the Beatles in order to save Apple and the Beatles, as well as to release Get Back, directed by director Peter Jackson, which allowed us to release Anthology and all these great remasters of all the great Beatles records. All of it would have belonged to Alan Klein if I hadn't done that. I was only given one option to get us out of it, so I went with what I did." The Beatles formally disbanded on December 29, 1974, marking the end of the band's protracted legal battles. The Apple Corps, which was responsible for the release of the Beatles, Rock Band, the remastering of the Beatles catalog, and the creation of Michael Jackson's The Beatles Get Back documentary in 2021, is still owned by McCartney, Starr, and the estates of Lennon and Harrison.